Hi everybody, my name is Greg Anderson and this is the Good Timekeeping Show with Greg Anderson. Hey, today I want to talk about my preferred sources for the correct time over the last several decades. I probably learned how to tell time in the 1970s, and so then I became interested in having my own watch that I could wear to school. It was a wind-up mechanical watch that you had to, wind every day, and so accuracy probably wasn't my main concern at that time. I eventually got this watch just a couple years later, so hey, look at this stylish 1970s leather for the watch band. Started out as kind of a diver's watch, but I replaced it with that leather strap, and wow, that's pretty cool. So I wore those to school, and then I probably just set them according to the time around the house because I probably just trusted the adults around me to have clocks set to the right time. But I also became aware of a telephone number you could call, and then you would get the right time over the phone. So you'd dial this number, and then you'd hear kind of maybe an advertisement for the bank that was sponsoring this service. And so after they'd said, open up a checking account or whatever the message was, then they would say, at the tone, the time will be 5:35 and 10 seconds. And I figured because they were announcing the time down to the second, I could trust that as a source for the correct time. Now, eventually, they also added, the temperature as well. So it'd be like Continental Bank time is, 5:35, temperature 20 degrees, which was Fahrenheit because we were in Chicago. Anyway, another thing that I learned about the correct time is that I trusted the television networks. So in Chicago, all of the major networks owned the local affiliates. So the ABC station was owned by ABC, NBC, CBS owned their own stations, and they were all synchronized. So if a show was supposed to start at 7 o'clock on CBS and another show was supposed to start at 7 o'clock on NBC, they would start at the same time. If you had two TVs on, or you just kind of, an hour later tried the other channel, and when did that show start? It was right on time. They'd go from the local station identification to the network material right on time. You could set your clock by it. So that's what I relied on to set my clocks around the house and my watch to the right time. Then around 1977, I got my first digital watch. So LCD, it showed the hour and minute. And then if you press a button, it showed the month and the day of the month. And then if you press the button again, it would show you the seconds. So my watch could tell the time right down to the second, quartz accuracy. And then I really wanted my watch to be correct. And so I would very carefully, either call the phone number or watch the TV to set my watch to the right time. Now, not long ago, I was reminiscing about how you could call a phone number and get the time. And people said, oh yeah, popcorn. And I'm like, popcorn what? I didn't know. Apparently in parts of California and maybe other parts of the country, I don't know, over the numbers 2 through 9, there are letters of the alphabet. So if you spelled out the word popcorn, which was 7672676, so if you called that number, that turned out to be the number to call for that time service. Well, when I started setting my watch to the right time, and then I went to school, my junior high school, I realized that the clocks in school were not correct. See, we had already recognized, some of my friends and I recognized, that each room in the school had its own clock that was identical and was hooked up to a master clock in the office. So when you went from one room to another, if your watch was set to the one time, it would be the same time in the other room. However, those clocks were wrong. They were off by somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes. I don't remember exactly how much, but I knew at the time exactly how far off those clocks were from the correct time that I was getting from TV. So then I had this dilemma. Do I set my watch to the time at school or to the correct time? And usually I would set it to the time at school because I wanted to know when the bell was going to ring, when this class was going to be over and that class was going to start. So maybe during the week, I set it to the wrong time at school. I get home on the weekend or summer vacation. I couldn't wait to set my watch to the right time again. So I had that struggle through, well, really, I think even when I was in the university, they had some sort of master clock that wasn't exactly right. I don't think it was off by as much as 2 minutes, but it was off by some. And so I don't think that that's quite as much of a problem today, but maybe you tell me, because I haven't been to school for a long time. All right, so this is what it was like for me to know the correct time during the 1970s. But I also had this notion of there is some sort of master clock called an atomic clock. I don't know who first told me about it, maybe my older brother, but I just knew that if it said it was an atomic clock and scientists said that this atomic clock was correct, the most correct clock ever built by people, then I trusted that. And so I wanted to confirm that, the clocks that they were setting at the TV networks were going off of the master clock, the atomic clock, and I got the notion that was true. But I didn't really know how to access time from the atomic clock at the time until this came along. So this is a 1980s style portable stereo. At the time, some people called them boom boxes. At first, we didn't know what to call them. So I think I called mine a portable cranker. That sounded like a Chicago thing to say. Portable cranker. We're going to crank some tunes on this portable cranker. So there wasn't quite the standardization that eventually came around with these things. So like this one has some jacks for external speakers. Now later on, the manufacturers realized we don't need to put external speakers on these things. People are just going to use them self-contained. So they stopped doing that. Also, this one has a cassette player and recorder and AM/FM radio, but it also has a shortwave radio on it. So that was something that a lot of the other manufacturers didn't bother with, but this one, shortwave radio. So I started experimenting with listening to shortwave radio. It works better at night. So in the middle of the night, you put this thing up and to get best reception, and you start tuning around, and really noisy shortwave. I don't know. You have to be real careful about how you're tuning it in. I can get this to turn on, but unfortunately, I don't think it actually works correctly anymore. But so what I would do is I'd go around and I'd find things like the BBC World News. So I'd listen to someone announcing the news in an English accent, and I thought that was cool. Or some things were just in a completely different foreign language that I didn't understand, and so it was kind of fun to hear those. And then I started hearing this unusual broadcast that I would kind of carefully tune in, and it sounded like this.
At the tone, 23 hours, 20 minutes, Coordinated Universal Time.
So eventually I started listening to this a little bit more and more, and you'd hear some voice announcements there telling you this was WWV out of Fort Collins, Colorado, from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and that's when I realized, oh wait, this is the atomic clock. This is it. This is the government's clock that is right. So that became my go-to for the correct time through the 1980s. I had my shortwave radio, and that's what I did to get the correct time and set my watches and all the clocks around the house according to that. And I probably didn't care if I was late for school or early for school. I kept my watches and clocks there. These days, like I said, this doesn't really work right anymore, but I have this little, portable shortwave radio with digital tuning, and this one works pretty well. Again, working better at night than during the day, but this nice shortwave radio, and you can easily tune in WWV on here. Now, there's also, in the 1980s, there was a company that had been around for a while, but in the 1980s, it was still around, called Heathkit. And Heathkit would sell these electronics kits where you could assemble all the pieces yourself. You'd learn a little bit about what the electronic components were, but mostly it was just follow the instructions and do the soldering, and you could build something. So Heathkit had a clock radio that was kind of similar to, the size and the basic look of something like this, but instead of playing the radio stations for you, the radio receiver in there was actually picking up WWV like this was and interpreting what it was receiving and automatically setting the time. It was the, what did they call it? They called it the GC1000, the most accurate clock. And it was available starting around 1983. You could buy the kit for like $250 and put it together yourself. Or if you wanted to buy one that was already built, it was like $400. And I was really not aware of this at the time. And if I had been, as a teenager, paying hundreds of dollars for a clock probably would have been prohibitive for me, just a luxury item, and I would just rely on my shortwave radio and manually set my clocks rather than have one that would automatically set itself. But that was something that was around way back in 1983. Heathkit was one of those things where you could go to a stereo store and get all kinds of features on your stereo, but then if you got one from Heathkit, it might have like one extra feature that nobody else had. So that was kind of a cool thing. Not only that you assembled it yourself, but it had this extra feature. The TV from Heathkit might have one thing that your average TV didn't have. And of course, this most accurate clock radio that they had was certainly something you wouldn't find at any typical store. So hats off to Heathkit. But for the whole 1980s, I relied on my shortwave radio for the correct time. Then came the 1990s. Well, now let me just quickly tell you, in the 1980s is when I first started hearing about global positioning satellites, or GPS, right? The military was using this, and what it is satellites that are thousands of miles out there, orbiting the Earth, and they orbit in such a way that no matter where you are on the face of the Earth, if you have an unobstructed view of the sky, so there aren't a lot of buildings and trees and things kind of getting in the way. But if you're out in the open, then where you are, and if you've got a GPS receiver, you can receive from several different satellites at once. And these satellites are broadcasting time data to your receiver. And so on board these satellites are atomic clocks that in theory are all perfectly synchronized. And so when your receiver is receiving from more than 2 or 3 satellites, and a lot of times you can probably receive at least 6 in any open area, probably a lot more than that depending on where you are. So as your GPS receiver is receiving the time data streams from these GPS, the satellites there, then it's able to tell that, well, this time stream is a little bit ahead of, or just fractions of a second ahead or behind that one. And it compares them to those two with that one, and also has some information in there where the GPS receiver is able to tell where those satellites are supposed to be, and then measuring the minute time differences between those satellites, it's able to interpret how far away it is from them, and then is able to tell you where you are on the face of the Earth, including your altitude. So latitude, longitude, altitude, your GPS receiver can figure that out. So this was happening as far back as the 1980s. The military was doing this. But they were scrambling the signal just a little bit. So if you had military-grade reception on your GPS receiver, then you could get pretty accurate with the GPS reception. But if you were using a consumer-grade GPS unit, you wouldn't be as accurate, because we didn't want the wrong people to get that technology and start using it against us, right? Operation Desert Storm, they had smart bombs, and they would program GPS coordinates into the smart bomb, and that would deliver those bombs just right on someone's doorstep practically, because of the precision of the military-grade stuff. So that was the late 80s into the beginning of the 90s, but starting in the very end of the 90s, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich made a deal, and they decided, it was okay to not scramble the GPS system anymore. And so suddenly, consumer-grade GPS receivers became really, really good, really, really accurate. And so I don't know how well you remember, but if you were around the year 2000 paying attention to like sporting goods stores starting to sell GPS receivers for hikers and boaters and fishermen, and even the beginnings of selling them for car navigation, the market really took off right about 1999-2000, and it's because the scrambling was turned off and the whole system was much more accurate. So because your GPS receiver that you're using today, and even the ones back then, are all based on time information coming from these atomic clocks that are orbiting the Earth, then your GPS receiver is able to give you atomic time. So you look at the time on your GPS, that's going to be a good source of atomic time. But again, I didn't know that until the very end of the 1990s when I finally got one of my own. But during the 1990s, some other things happened, okay? So let's back up. beginning of the 1990s, cell phones were those big brick cell phones, right? And they couldn't do much except send and receive phone calls. But eventually they got smaller and they got digital. So digital cell phones, suddenly the cell phone service provider was able to send digital data along with you're talking to people. So that's when they started to embed time information into the data that's coming into your phone. So your phone could automatically update the time based on what the cell phone service provider was giving it. So again, that wasn't until the late 1990s when digital cell phones became much more common. But I will tell you that when that happened, when the cell phones started having clocks in them and getting that time, it wasn't quite as accurate as the WWV, atomic time information. It was maybe within a minute, but it wasn't like right down to the second for most cell phones most of the time. That came a little bit later, but that was the introduction of using your cell phone to get the correct time and also update the time for things like daylight saving time or when you switch time zones and stuff like that. Another phenomenon of the 1990s was that, well, it started kind of in the late 80s, but really took hold in the 1990s, was people had computers in their home. The personal home computer became a more commonplace. And maybe you've noticed this, maybe you haven't. The computer clocks by themselves are really not very good. They're not quartz accuracy by any means. So a quartz watch or a quartz clock will be accurate to within a few seconds every month. But computer maybe only a few seconds every day. And at the end of a whole month, your computer clock could be off by a minute or two. And that could be very annoying if you're a guy like I am. And so I would often, throughout the early 1990s, I would set the clock on my computer often to make sure it was pretty close to where I wanted it to be. But then in the late 1990s, pretty late, like 1997, 98, that's when a lot of people started having the internet in their home for the first time. So with the internet in your home, the people making these operating systems for your Macs and your PCs, they decided to add automatic time updates to the operating system. So now your computer would get on the internet and search for time on time servers and then bring that back in and automatically set the clock, the internal clock of the computer's motherboard, BIOS system, whatever. So all of a sudden, computer clocks became really good because they were being updated by an external source every day. So that's why you don't really worry about your computer very much. But try this. If you've got a computer that doesn't need to be on the internet, just turn off the Wi-Fi or unplug the Ethernet and leave that computer for about a week not updating itself, and then see how far off the clock is. You'll be amazed. All right, so another thing that happened in the 1990s is all of a sudden I get this catalog in the mail from some company. I don't even know how I got on their mailing list. It must have been it was meant to be, because Lifestyle Fascination, this mail order company that sold a lot of weird gadgets and stuff similar to like Hammacher Schlemmer, suddenly I got their catalog and it had this on the back page. This is the Junghans Mega Clock. Okay, and it was on sale from $250 down to just $200. $200 for a clock? Well, this time I could not resist. It doesn't do much. It shows you the time, hours, minutes, and seconds, and it also shows you the date. You can set it to one of 4 time zones in the continental United States. That's all it does. It sets itself and then keeps itself updated by checking itself every night. It also automatically changes for daylight saving time, and I knew that when I saw this, I would have to have one. This is the one I got in 1995, and here it is right now, the year 2020. It's working like it always has. It's still in perfect condition. I liked it so much that I spent about $300 for the wall clock version of the same thing. So here they are. I'm very proud of my Junghans Mega Clocks, but these cost me a lot of money. Also, about 1996 is the first time I saw an ad for an alarm clock that not only would show you the time, but then it also had alarms and stuff on it. And this was from Oregon Scientific. Now, I've got it around here somewhere in a bin or something, because I think I kind of scratched it up once upon a time. So I could probably get it out and polish and make it look nice again. But in the meantime, this one is pretty much the same thing with the Radio Shack name on it. I think they just licensed the technology and put it in a slightly different shaped case. It has an external antenna because back in the 1990s, the transmitter power for WWVB that it receives wasn't as strong as it is today. So if you buy these from Oregon Scientific today, they will have an internal antenna, and that works just as well as this external antenna. But back in the day, external antenna was good because you could kind of position this away from the clock, and rotate the antenna orientation to make it receive better. But again, this is hours, minutes, and seconds from any of the 4 time zones in the continental United States, shows you the date, and then it also has a daily alarm and a snooze, and it was $99. And I think a lot of people thought, well, why would I want to spend $99 on something that does the same thing as a $15 clock at Walmart? Except that, this one sets itself, I think that's worth a little bit more than, for that feature. Maybe not worth, $85 more, but I bought one, and then eventually when they started selling them at Radio Shack, I think they were down to like $50 at that point. And then when it went on sale, I got 2 or 3 of these for maybe $30. So that was getting within range of, now this is good, and I hope these things really take off when people recognize how cool they are. I think the external antenna was probably a drawback back then. But anyway, those are some good ways. And again, these still work. Good ways to have sources of atomic time that became available in the mid to late 1990s. Incidentally, if you're interested in listening to the WWV broadcast and you don't have a shortwave radio, you can just call the phone number. Yeah, it's not a local call, so if you live outside of the Fort Collins, Colorado area, you might have to pay a toll. But most of us now, with our cell phone plans or even some of our landline plans, you can make long distance calls without any extra charge for that. So try it out. The phone number is 303 area code, so 303-499-7111. Give them a call. You can't, last time I tried it, after 2 or 3 minutes, it just automatically hung up on me. You can't leave it on all day long. But that's a good way to listen to the voice announcements and all those tones and things. There's a slight delay depending on your network. So anywhere from 30 to 150 millisecond delay. For most of us, that's enough to set my watch, but you might not want to do very precise scientific experiments based on that phone number if you're concerned about the delay. Also, there's WWVH out of Kauai in Hawaii, and that number is 808-335-4363. So you can dial those up if you don't have a shortwave radio and kind of have the dulcet tones of the tones and the announcers telling you what time it is. And one more note about the 1990s and these Junghans clocks. They also made a watch, the Junghans Mega Watch. It was $1,000. And it did the same as these clocks here. It did not have an alarm, didn't have chimes, didn't have stuff like that. It just told you the time. $1,000. I just couldn't do it. I waited just 3 or 4 years, and I got this Archron Sight. This is not a good looking watch, but it does set itself to the right time. It's basically the first atomic watch I got, and I think it was $99. If you watch my channel, you know that I have a lot of radio-controlled watches, most of them from Casio. And so I think the technology has really matured to a place where I really like it. So a lot of very good ones that cost less than $100 and are much better looking and tougher than this one. But this one still works, so it holds a place of prestige in my household because it was my first radio-controlled watch. And of course, today, if you look around, you can find some inexpensive radio-controlled clocks and watches. You can get, analog wall clocks and digital wall clocks, large, small. There's a lot of good stuff out there. Maybe cost just a little bit more than your average, cheapest clock available at Walmart, but just for a few dollars more, I really like that extra function that it sets itself, especially for a collector like me with lots of clocks around. Boy, when it comes to daylight saving time and stuff like that, it's nice to have the watches take care of setting themselves. for when those changes come around. But so you have access to atomic time and the correct time through your cell phone, which is now internet connected. Your smartphone, your tablets, those things are going to update themselves and be accurate to within a fraction of a second every day, depending on how often they set themselves. There's some good apps. I recommend one that I really like. It was free from Emerald Sequoia. I think it's called Emerald Time. And just a very simple app. What it does is it checks some time servers all around the internet and then sets itself to kind of an average of those times and shows you how those different sources maybe vary from each other. It gives you a little readout there. So that's nice, almost like GPS is calculating the differences between those time streams. A very simple one, you can just go to the website time.gov. And it will show you the time. That's from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It will kind of automatically sense the time zone that you're in, and then it'll display the time. I like that one. Of course, GPS receivers are going to show you the right time. Maybe you've got satellite radio in your car. Those sorts of things are often going to show you the right time. They'll have some sort of time stream embedded in the system. So, those are pretty good. I still think my favorite one to rely on more consistently might be, say, the Emerald Time app, or of course all my clocks that are so good at keeping time. Relying on television broadcasts is no longer a good idea, I'm afraid. You see, I've done some work for a TV station in Salt Lake City, and I know that when they're doing the news, okay, and they have the time readout right in the corner of the screen next to the station logo, and that updates every minute as you're watching the news broadcast. I know that when you're in the studio, that does update at the correct time. However, by the time that stream, that digital television stream, goes from the studio to the transmitter, maybe to the cable system, maybe to a satellite provider, and then up to the satellite and back down to your satellite receiver, and then into your TV. Each time that stream is passed from one node to the other, if you will, that stream has to be recognized as a stream and then passed through, and then recognized as a stream and passed through. And so that causes a little bit of a delay every time that gets transcoded or just passed from one node to the other. And so I know, like I said, when I'm in the studio, that clock changes at the right time. But here at my house, it might be 5 seconds slow if I'm getting it over a direct over-the-air signal with an antenna on my house. But if it's coming through the satellite, it's even slower than that. The cable news networks, Fox News and CNN, they have the clock in the corner, and those are sometimes like 15 seconds slow. It's not because they broadcast it too slow at the studio. They change at the right time, but the streaming makes it slow down. So you can no longer rely on that clock. I'm sad about that. But of course, now you know better, and now you can figure out the best way to have some reliable sources of atomic time, correct time for you. Set all your clocks correctly and be happy about it. All right, well, that's all for now. I have some other ideas, so stay tuned. It's been very busy lately, but as soon as I get that time, I'm going to make even more episodes of The Good Timekeeping Show.